All right. Good morning, everybody. I had to hide outside because it's too noisy on the inside right now. I have a feeling this is going to be a really, really long video, so my apologies. It's all about low unemployment. As you know, low unemployment is a major macroeconomic objective of a company. It's usually something that they like to show off. When the employment is low, it's a big headline for the news, even when it's as low as 0.1%. The first important thing is to make sure you understand what they mean by unemployment. You have to know what the definition of it is before you can start calculating it. But when you read articles such as this one here, which talks about Canada unemployment rate edge up to 6.4, you'll see articles and headlines like this all the time. But there's a lot of interesting points that you want to make note of, and these are just points in general that apply to unemployment in an economy. Unemployment essentially means jobless. All right, so it's exactly how you think. A change in unemployment rate, even to the smallest degree, can be considered big news. The unemployment rate is affected by how many jobs are created in the economy, and then the number of jobs created are going to vary across industries. So obviously some industries may have increases while others a decrease, and it could be different for different groups, like men or women. While a country tends to publicize national unemployment rates, the rates are going to differ sometimes from region to region. So you have some areas of the country have an increase in unemployment, and other areas a decrease, but overall it might be an increase or decrease. So just remember that. The numbers can be tricky. Many things will affect unemployment, things like exchange rates, costs of raw materials, any type of international economic conditions. So what's going on in other countries directly impact unemployment, not just stuff going on locally. Unemployment rate can have an effect on wage rates. So those are all just some things that you should be able to assume from changes of employment or unemployment. So how is it measured? People, so this is the definition now of unemployment. It's really important to define it in this way. People of working age who are without work, available for work, and actively seeking employment. So it's not people who have retired, it's not children who physically can't work, or people in school who are studying and not looking for jobs. It's only people who are of age, are able to work and don't have it, are available, and are actively seeking work. If you're not even looking for work, you're not considered as unemployed. So it's pretty much the economically active population when you look at it. So once again, students attending school are not part of this workforce. Children staying at home, stay-at-home moms or dads, people like that who aren't looking for work, retired people, they don't count in those numbers. It's actually really quite difficult to measure the size of the labor force. And that's something that each country probably have their own system of doing. And it could be inconsistent. So sometimes inaccuracies of data and ways of measuring can impact the overall numbers, and that's always going to be a disadvantage in economics, where your numbers aren't necessarily bang on. So there's something called also hidden unemployment. So hidden unemployment is when the calculation of unemployment doesn't include some of this hidden unemployment that is present in several groups of people. The first group of people are those who've been unemployed for a really long period of time and have pretty much just given up. So they were initially part of the workforce, and then because they took so long for them to find a job that they were willing and able to access, they just quit looking. So now all of a sudden unemployment has dropped. Well, not really. They just gave up. Another group of people who are on part-time work. So they're working, but that's not really their goal. It's not making enough money for them to sustain their family. So technically they're employed, but once again, and then they're not showing up in the numbers there because it's with their intention to find a better and new job. So there are some instances of hidden unemployment. I'm not going to belabor that point because it's pretty straightforward. So let's talk now about the distribution of unemployment. So along with the different methods of measurement, as well as like hidden unemployment and things like that, it's also important to look at indicators that the countries adopt to measure unemployment. You have to be really careful about the national rate as the basis for making a conclusion, because once again there could be some little disparities, we call them. So there could be geographical disparities where, once again, some areas might be doing amazing and other areas might be doing completely crap. So the inner cities tend to have a really high unemployment versus the suburban or rural areas where, they have land and they have, nice houses. And age disparities also. The under 25 group, which is going to be you guys pretty soon, tend to have really high unemployment because they have less experience. Ethnic differences, sometimes minorities, oftentimes suffer higher levels of unemployment than other people. So the reason could be is that they're not getting the same education opportunities. It could be due to prejudices by employers, so they're less willing to hire minorities, stuff like that. And then, of course, last but not least, gender disparities, where there could be higher rates among women than men. So once again, it could just be discrimination. It could be down to just, in some countries, men having more opportunities for better education, things like that. Let's talk about the cost of unemployment. The reason why the governments care so flippin' much about unemployment is by reducing unemployment level, they can improve their economy because a lot of money is spent on unemployed. Types of cost of unemployment vary. You have the cost to the people themselves. So people who are unemployed face a lot of issues. They receive less income than they would like to have if they were employed. So clearly, especially if there's no benefits from the government, it will get to the point where they couldn't even feed themselves. It could get pretty drastic. So a reduction in income implies a lower standard of living for people and their families. And this can just get worse and worse over time. You could start feeling dejected, it could lead to anxiety, depression. So there's a lot of cost to the workers themselves who are unemployed. Society also bear a cost. The social costs of unemployment are things like increased poverty, homelessness, and with that then comes higher rates of crime, vandalism, gangs, things like that. So clearly that's not going to be a good benefit to society. So that's why you want unemployment. And then the other cost, the final cost, is the cost of the economy as a whole. If you looked at a production possibility curve, right, you could see with unemployment, you're never going to reach your full employment, which means that there's always going to be spare capacity and you're not going to have efficiency. Your output isn't going to reach the right rate if your labor force is not fully employed to the right extent. So it hurts the economy. Unemployed people who have lower income pay less direct taxes, so that's less money the government can spend and improve the country and improve the economy. So let's now look at the main factors that affect unemployment. There's a lot of different things that could affect the quote-unquote employment pool, as we call it. So that's the available amount of employment for society. So let's look at the inflows. So these are factors that can cause a rise in unemployment. People who've lost their jobs, resigned, left school but not found work yet, people who are trying to return to work out after left. So let's say if you were a stay-at-home parent and then all of a sudden you want to start working again, so now boom, that's caused an increase, an inflow of unemployment. And then people who've immigrated into the country and not found work yet, so immigrants can be also a cause of higher unemployment. At the same time, you have outflows. Those are things or factors that can decrease unemployment levels. People who then find jobs, people who officially retire, people who go back into school. So if you go back and try and continue your education, people who emigrate, right? So that's when you leave your country and go to other countries. People who choose to stay home with their kids, probably me in a couple months. People who give up the job search, people who pass away. So there's a lot of ways that the unemployment level also decreases, and that's called an outflow of unemployment. So causes, there are a couple main categories of unemployment. Now you don't really need this according to the IBDP syllabus, but it is helpful to know just so that you better understand. So when you look at, it's kind of like a supply and demand curve. When you look at labor, the equilibrium of labor in the market, you can see that there's the demand for labor and the supply for labor. And where they meet, just like in microeconomics, is your equilibrium. So this wage rate, and this is a real wage rate, so inflation is accommodated for in case inflation year on year varies. And that's the quantity of labor supplied at that wage. So if you pay people this much, that's how many people will be employed and working, right? So that's the basics of a supply and demand. The labor market represents the demand and supply for all labor in the economy. All right, so make sure you understand that this isn't just for a single industry. So we're looking at the labor for the entire economy. So it includes the demand not just for one type of worker, but everyone. So pizza delivery drivers, mechanics, bankers, salesmen, everything is all included in that demand for labor. So it is a macro view. Remember, this is macroeconomics. The aggregate demand curve slopes downward because obviously the real wage level, producers are more willing to take on a lot more labor when the wages are lower. So you can see that the quantity, see here how it goes down, the quantity of demand increases as the wages decrease. You're going to want more and more labor when it's cheaper to pay them because it doesn't impact your costs of operations. And then it's the opposite on the supply side. Obviously, you're going to see a much flatter supply curve because initially less people are going to be willing to work, right, at certain wages. And then as the wage increases, more and more people are willing to jump into the labor pool because it's worth their time now, isn't it? So the aggregate demand for labor curve is dependent on aggregate demand of the economy. That's something that's important to know. Most of the time, you can assume that if the economy's aggregate demand is doing really well, then there'll be more demand for labor because you've opened up more stores, you're producing more things, you're going to need more manpower, more factors of production to create those. The aggregate supply of labor curve it pretty much illustrates the total number of the economy's workers that are willing and able to work at a given wage rate. As the wage rates increase, more and more people are willing to work. All right, so the equilibrium is where it meets. Let's talk now about disequilibrium of unemployment. So there are a couple of ways that clearing can be prevented. So clearing, once again, is where you're above or below the equilibrium point, and then due to market forces, it then comes back into that sweet spot, right? So let's take a look at the first type, real wage unemployment or classical unemployment. This is a kind of unemployment viewed in the classical terms where some unemployment is caused by trade unions and governments intervening too much. So that's why it's classical, because it's anti-government intervention, right? Let's say, for example, if a minimum wage is introduced, that will bring up the wage to this level, right? So it's almost like this curve now looks very similar to a price minimum when we looked in microeconomics of government interventions. So what you can see is that at this wage, the supply actually is much higher than what the demand will be. So what it does is it causes issues, a disequilibrium, and it can't clear back into WE, your wage equilibrium, because legally it's not allowed to go below this point. So it creates a shortage in an excess of supply of labor as a result. So because of this issue of wages, either minimum wage being set or let's say trade unions step in and they're able to negotiate really high wages for people, and now the companies are no longer willing to hire as many people because they're too expensive, it creates this disparity. So you can see here that a disequilibrium occurs. So how do you fix this? Well, there's only two real ways of fixing it. You remove minimum wage, or you try and remove the power of trade unions, but that's not easy to do. It's really difficult, and when you do that, it's usually the poorest people, because it's only the lowest income that are on minimum wage. Wealthier people aren't on minimum wage anyway. Minimum wage going up or down doesn't impact them. They're making way above that. So it creates more income disparity, and it doesn't really help society too much. So it's really hard to manage, actually. Demand deficient unemployment is another one. So you had the first example where it was created by a real wage unemployment, right? So that's where there's some sort of intervention creating it. Let's take a look at the demand deficient or cyclical unemployment. This kind of equilibrium is associated with the economy. The economy moves into slower periods of growth, which means demand will fall, and then it gets higher, so demand increases. So it's likely to lead to a demand or increase in labor as a result. So you can assume, let's say, for example, here, this is, you can see this is the Keynesian curve for supply and demand of the economy, aggregate supply and demand. So if there's a drop in demand because the economy is worse, you're going to see a shift from this point to this point. So your output has decreased. And then you can see a very similar thing happen in the supply of labor. So with a shift in aggregate demand of labor, you now have a huge shift in quantity from quantity equilibrium here at the point B to quantity equilibrium at point A. So what it shows here is that although the equilibrium point is at C, and it tends to stick downwards, you can't actually go downwards. They call this stickiness in terms of the wages. Wages can't fall below. And there's a few reasons for that. So normally when this shift occurs, firms would lower their wages and then it would create an equilibrium. But things like labor contracts, sometimes if you sign someone for a 2-year contract, you can't lower their wages randomly because the economy's temporarily gone down. The other thing is motivation levels. A lot of employers would be afraid to decrease motivation and the quality because then that can hurt their sales and hurt their brand reputation. So there's a lot of forces preventing it to clear off at C. So it ends up creating this big disparity once again. The quantity of labor is much less here at that level, so it creates a labor shortage. So you can see how unemployment due to cyclical conditions, changes in the economy, can devastate you. So the solution to this, to demand deficient unemployment, where it's based on the economy and cycles and stuff, well, the problem is due to a low level of aggregate demand. So what are the things that we learned about before to increase aggregate demand? Fiscal and monetary policies. So demand side policies, right? By lowering taxes or increasing government spending or lowering interest rates, you can spark up demand, and then with the hopes to then shift the labor supply back in the right direction, which would get rid of this shortage of labor. Does that make sense? So at this point, you could step in with demand side policy, fiscal monetary policy, to try and improve the unemployment conditions there. Equilibrium unemployment, this is called natural unemployment. So there's different types of unemployments, right? Theoretically, a labor market might be in an equilibrium with no demand deficient or real wage unemployment, but there still might be people who are unemployed. Because remember what the definition was? That you need to have people who are willing and able to work. So there might still be people out there, but they might not be willing and or able to work at this level. It could be things like maybe the jobs are only available in certain sectors and you don't have that experience. So you're not able to work there, so you remain unemployed, even though we're at equilibrium. So you can see issues that come up. So the diagram here introduces a new curve when you're talking about natural unemployment or equilibrium unemployment. There's another curve which is actually the total labor force when you include those people who are not willing and or able to. So it could also be on the other extreme where a doctor is not going to take up a position as a toilet cleaner because they're overqualified and they spend all those years and money on school, so they're going to remain unemployed even if there's still jobs and they could still reach equilibrium and have a job. Does that make sense? So it's difficult to observe on the diagram, but there are, in fact, it's not a disequilibrium in the labor market. It means that there are jobs available from A to B, but those people aren't willing or able to take it. So a gap comes between the aggregate supply of the labor curve, and the curve becomes smaller as the wages get higher. So you can see this gap gets less and less as wages get higher, because then there's less disparity. More people are obviously willing and able to work when the wages increase. So you'll see here that the gap is a lot bigger at the lower end, and then it's kind of shrinkens out just because of logic. You know, people would then be more willing or able to invest in training or education to take that job if the wage is high, right? Let's talk now about frictional unemployment. I'm sorry, guys. I'm just going to keep going and going and going. It's a lot. Frictional unemployment is the short-term unemployment that occurs when people are in between jobs. So they've left school and they're trying to get into a job, or they're trying to quit their jobs to find a better one. So it can be perceived as negative, but this is, once again, short-term. As soon as the members of the labor force get a job, they'll be able to then contribute more to the economy. So it's less drastic than some of the other issues of unemployment. Ways of solving this. So it's not seen as a serious problem in the economy because it's so short term. But some would argue that people have little incentive to find jobs if benefits are really high. So by lowering unemployment benefits, you might get people to get off their butts and find jobs a lot quicker. While if they're chilling, getting unemployment, still able to eat, still able to go out, spend a bit of money, feed their family, they might be less aggressive in terms of looking. So sometimes people who are frictionally unemployed actually end up remaining without a job or work because they don't have appropriate vacancies that exist. And actually, frictional unemployment can then um, become natural unemployment over time. A lot of times it's there because they are unaware of different job openings. So this is where the government then, so other than lowering the benefits, they can actually try and increase awareness. So job internet sites, newspapers, job centers, counselors. This is another kind of interventionist approach to trying to improve or get rid of this frictional employment. So the people who are looking for jobs recently entered the workforce know where the jobs are and can find them. Seasonal, so similar to the economic downturn, sometimes in certain seasons, people are useless. So for example, in a cold winter, construction workers or farmers might not be out there because it's physically impossible to get work done. Tourism industry works in seasons also, so there's going to not be a lot of ski instructor demand in July in Austria because it's hot and there's no snow. So solution for seasonal unemployment can be to reduce encouraging people to take different jobs in their off season. Because if people keep hopping jobs back and forth, there's always a bit of a gap between finding a new job and an old job, and it can create longer periods of unemployment. So once again, reduce unemployment benefits. That way people don't leave their jobs, they stick around, and then hopefully that helps on frictional. All right, now let's get to the nasty one, structural unemployment. This is the worst kind of equilibrium unemployment, and it occurs when there's a change in the structure of an economy. The difference between structural